but thank you for staying on for this. I'm speaking here, was it 4 times, which seems a lot in anticipation, but I know from hard experience that on the topic that I deal with on religious liberty, you can talk for hour after hour after hour on theory and on practice. I could tell a lot of stories about people standing for their faith. But there's something I want to share today that's a little bit more like a teaching session, but I really think you need to know it. The first meeting I took the other day, I mentioned that it's the 500th anniversary of the Reformation next year. And I hope there's a lot of celebration in this country. I hope. I don't know that you'll hear about it all the time, because things have changed since the United States was formed. Things have changed since the times of the Reformation, and not all for the good. Not too long ago, in one of the presidential elections, Senator Santorum, a Roman Catholic, a very nice man, but as dedicated a Catholic as you'll get, so he has an agenda a little bit different than Protestants and Seventh-day Adventists. And during the campaign, he was quoted in the news media, and it made a bit of a fuss. He said, "Protestantism is absent in America today." And I think it's true. Hopefully with Adventism it's not absent, but all around us it's gone. When I was studying American history, I remember being quite taken with the letters between 2 of the early presidents, Thomas Jefferson and President Adams, the second and the third presidents. They were bitter political enemies. I don't know how many of you remember your US history. It wasn't all sweetness and light, apart from the Civil War, which of course was horribly bloodthirsty. But from the beginning, there were contentious political battles. And Thomas Jefferson became quite an enemy of Adams. And in fact, when Jefferson was elected, I know in Washington, if you visit there, you can see his Jefferson Memorial. He's there for the ages as one of the heroes of the Republic. But when he was elected, it was quite a scandal, because most people, I guess not most because he was elected, but many people thought that this was a disgrace to elect an atheist. And he wasn't quite an atheist, but pretty close. And they thought the Republic was finished. And what was interesting to me is to read their letters, these 2 elderly men, growing older and older, exchanging letters in their final days, and they both died on the same day, 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. Very interesting. And in fact, Adams, I think it was, as he was dying, he says, "And Jefferson still lives?" He said Jefferson died later the same day. But they discussed many, many things. And one of the things they discussed was whether Christianity would survive in the United States. Seems self-evident to us today, but they wondered whether it would. And Jefferson thought not. He didn't think it would survive. But Adams was a little more hopeful, and he says, "Yes, it will survive." And this is what he wrote. Very interesting. I'll tell you the thought process of Protestants at that time. He says, "Yes, it will survive, but first, that Hindu Kabbalistic system known as Roman Catholicism must die. At present, it has a mortal wound, but such is its strength that it may take 200 years yet to die." We're 200 years down from those guys. It's not dead. In fact, last year, the present Pope gave a speech to the Houses of Congress that it demonstrated that, as the Bible says, the whole world is wondering after this old power that's been reinstated. Protestants and Seventh-day Adventists had a lot to say about the role of the Roman Catholic Church. And, we're always a little bit nervous about it, because it can be cast as us being at enmity with the Roman Catholics themselves. They're human beings like you and I. They come in all different stripes. Some of them much more pious than perhaps some of us. Others very nominal. But it isn't really about Roman Catholics as followers of that system. It's about the system. And Protestants did recognize, but most preeminently with Martin Luther, recognized that Roman Church, which had become the dominant church in the Western world, really through a complicated and at times bloody story. Like at the moment, if you're following issues with Russia, they're emerging again as the champion of Christendom, to use the term Ellen White often used. The Eastern Orthodox Church is the separated half of the Christian church. And Rome had a lot to do with that separation because the Eastern Church wouldn't accept the claim of the Roman Church that the Pope was the preeminent spiritual leader. They wouldn't accept their ideas of the Trinity, which were rather pagan. But that doesn't mean the Eastern Orthodox Church are correct in everything either. But the Catholic Church has made bold claims and at times been a bold persecutor of those that differed from its ideas, which you can clearly claim had developed more from paganism than from pure biblical history and from Bible study. The Reformation was all about pointing back to that church, which made a claim to be the body of Christians from the beginning. Half true, because it was the aggregate of those who had taken the name Christian, but it was designed to clear out the errors. Didn't really work, and it clearly hasn't worked to this day. In Great Controversy, Ellen White says something. She says a lot of things about the Catholic Church, but I think this is relevant to today. This is what she says in chapter 35, Liberty of Conscience Threatened. She says, Romanism is now regarded by Protestants with far greater favour than in former years. That's true, isn't it? Absolutely, in this once Protestant country. In those countries where Catholicism is not in the ascendancy and the papists are taking a conciliatory course in order to gain influence, there is an increasing indifference concerning the doctrines that separated the Reformed churches from the papal hierarchy. The opinion is gaining ground that after all we do not differ so widely upon vital points as has been supposed, and that a little concession on our part will bring us into a better understanding with Rome. The time was when Protestants placed a high value upon the liberty of conscience, which had been so dearly purchased. They taught their children to abhor popery and held that to seek harmony with Rome would be disloyalty with God. But how widely different are the sentiments now expressed. And I'll just read this first statement of the next paragraph. The defenders of the papacy declare that the church has been maligned and the Protestant world are inclined to accept the statement. Many urge that it is unjust to judge the church of today by the abominations and absurdities that marked her reign during the centuries of ignorance and darkness. They excuse her horrible cruelty as a result of the barbarism of the times and plead that the influence of modern civilization has changed her sentiments. Have these persons forgotten the claim of infallibility put forth for 800 years by this power? So far from being relinquished, this claim was reaffirmed in the 19th century more than ever before. As Rome asserts, the Church never erred, nor will it, according to the Scripture, ever err. The Papal Church will never relinquish her claim to infallibility. All that she has done, and this is important, in her persecution of those who reject her dogmas, she holds to be right, and would she not repeat the same acts should the opportunity be presented? Let the restraints now imposed by secular governments be removed and Rome be reinstated, and there would speedily be a revival of her tyranny and persecution. Interesting. A few years ago, I went to Rome to attend a religious liberty conference that was put on by a Roman Catholic gentleman in Washington that we still deal with. You know, religious liberty is a broad front. You must understand it. Adventists are not the only ones. And curiously, the Roman Catholic Church has emerged as one of the champions for religious liberty. They define it a little bit differently, but I don't think they're insincere about it. You just have to watch where they're going with it. And this gentleman was put on a very good conference in Rome. It was actually at the Pontifical Gregorian University. And if you read a lot of Adventist material, that'll strike a bell, because that's where Dr. Samuel Bakioki studied. There were several cardinals in attendance, and it was like old home week for Roman Catholicism. It was interesting to hear their presentations. The second night of the conference, we had a reception, or they put on a reception at the U.S. ambassador's residence, the U.S. ambassador to the Vatican. It's an amazing thing, and I write about it in Liberty all the time. You know, this power that, according to prophecy, was struck down. General Berthier, acting for Napoleon Bonaparte, when they conquered Italy, he took the Pope prisoner, took away all of his lands and his power, and basically kept him a prisoner. And there, just before the outset of World War II, Benito Mussolini, the dictator, gave back power to Rome. He gave them some lands. I think it's 300 acres. There's more potato farms around here that are bigger than Rome. But it was enough for him to be the ruler of a state and to have diplomats all over the world. And I read the other day the agreement that Mussolini made with Rome. It was rather far-reaching. They paid them a lot of money, gave them the land, and then it says in the actual agreement, it says the cardinals are to be treated as princes of the blood, aristocracy, powerful leaders of the community. It's an amazing pass. So the US didn't used to be interested in this, but we actually send ambassadors now to Rome. So I wanted to see, what's this ambassador's residence like? Last night I told you about going to the ambassador's residence in Laos. Any ambassador's house you would expect would be like a little shrine to his country, because he's there to represent that country to the other country. So I attended this with one of our other religious liberty leaders from actually this union, and so the two of us walked through the ancient city of Rome that night. It was a beautiful evening, and we came to the ambassador's residence, and it was surrounded by a fairly tall stone fence with some barbed wire above it, but some nice plants growing there, and there was a guard gate, and we came early, so we had to talk our way through the gate, tell them who we were. Then halfway through, there was another security gate, and we talked to the fellow, and who are you with, or, and so on, and we got in. Then finally into the ambassador's residence. And I'll never forget going in there. I don't understand what was happening, because as we came in the foyer, this was during the Bush administration, there was only a picture of Cheney on the wall. Usually it's the president. And as we went into the home, which was beautifully decorated, or nicely decorated, but the style was not what I expected, because everywhere there were Roman Catholic artifacts. There were artifacts of Vatican City and statements of faith in Roman Catholicism. Nothing about the US. Nothing about a secular state. Nothing about separation of church and state. You might as well been going into one of the Catholic museum places in Rome. But it's worth reminding ourselves we have deep differences, and Rome is not a neutral player. They were told a little bit about it, but you need to know that the last 3 popes have been actively seeking to roll back Vatican II. And what I would tell you, and you need to know, when you hear some public statement that the Roman Catholic Church is reconsidering Vatican II, watch out, because that's the default setting. They will revert to the view that error has no rights. I want to tell you about some of the documents that have come out. And I don't know that each of you should read them, but you should be aware of them. I found that there's incredible ignorance in our membership about some of the more recent ones. One that most everybody knows. I'm sure if I asked your hands, you're somewhat aware of Dominus Dei, right? About the best part of 20 years ago now. This was under John Paul II, but it was written by the man soon to become Pope, his head of the Office of the Inquisition, who became Benedict. And Dominus Dei, I believe, was a very important document, and I see it echoing through many of their following documents. I don't know how they began it, but it looks to me like they took Samuel Bakioki's paper on the importance of Sabbath rest and basically borrowed it and put a twist in to apply Sunday. Because it's for the first time since the Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church admits freely that all of the texts that we use to prove the seventh-day Sabbath are valid. They don't dispute that in the slightest. In fact, they hold up the biblical aspect of the seventh-day rest. What they do in the document is about half, two-thirds of the way through, start applying the seventh-day Sabbath principle to the Eucharistic Sunday, saying that it fulfills more completely, and being basically the eighth day, it fulfills the Christian expectation now of a risen Saviour. And there's a weasel language in that document that really explains it all. Once you know that, they go through biblically upholding the Sabbath, explaining it, and then there's a point where they say, and this is the best I can do from memory, it says, even though the early Christian church had no instructions from the Lord, they felt that they had the authority to change the day to Sunday. And once that's done, off you go. So that's the first document that you should know about, but that is not the end of the game. There was another one that followed on a little later from that, and it created a huge furor within the Protestant world, but they got over it. I don't know about you, but I've been following most of my life the so-called ecumenical movement. And when I was much younger, it was openly designed to bring all the churches together as one single entity. I'm not really sure that's their design now. They're doing it in a different way. But they were literally wanting to combine all into the new reborn Roman Catholic Church. And in Australia, where I'm from, they ran a test case. They combined about 5 religions they sold all their property, put them in common, and they formed the Uniting Church. And it was interesting to see the run-through on that in Australia. They brought the Archbishop of Canterbury and some cardinals out there, and they ran history programs telling church history, of course, retelling it, revising it. And I remember the most classic one was the then Archbishop of Canterbury, interviewed about this, and he says, just put doctrine aside. We need to unite. It's a rebuke to the world, how we're fighting among ourselves. He says, let's all unite in the love of Christ. And put doctrine aside. He says, you must understand. He says, there's 2 levels of union. He says, the theologians, they debate things endlessly and try to dispute and integrate and so on. But he says the real level is where members of the different churches get together for afternoon tea. This is more of an English sensibility, maybe for coffee. Get together for a morning coffee. And he says, and they socialise, and that's it. He says, so join with us. And the interviewer, to his credit in Australia, he says, but, what about if after they join together, they can't reconcile these doctrinal differences? And I'll never forget what that Archbishop said. He looked into the camera and he says, it's like a diseased body. He says, if there's a diseased limb, he says it must be cut off and destroyed. So there's a hard edge to this supposedly kumbaya approach to coming together. But during that period, when it seemed that they were coming closer and closer together, suddenly Rome inserted a document called the Unicity of Salvation. Was actually its English title. They all have a Latin title. And it shocked the Protestants who were trying to unite on their own terms with Rome, because what it said was there is only one true Catholic Church, and that the separated churches, some of them are not even churches at all in any normal sense. They're only churches where they share the common Eucharist with the Catholic Church, and then they're separated churches. So, Rome slapped them around and said, we just don't think that you're respectable or to be taken seriously as Christians unless you join with us. And that was shocking. The next document you know about, but you never really heard about the document probably. Do you remember John Paul II in his dotage when he went to the Holy Land, leaning on a staff, portrayed in a very sympathetic way as doing a pilgrimage in his final years? They issued a document at that time called Memory and Reconciliation. Memory and Reconciliation. And in it, if you did read any of the articles or the news reports, supposedly the Catholic Church apologized for the persecution of the Jews, for the Inquisition. They apologized for the sack of Constantinople, and you didn't even know that they needed to on that, did you? The Eastern Orthodox do, because that's when the Roman Catholic Church showed a violent streak against the Eastern Church. They diverted one of the Crusades, rather than sending it directly to the Holy Land. They in Venice gave money and directions and sent them to attack the other Christian city, the new capital of Rome, Constantinople, to attack and pillage it and destroy their religious competition. Rome remembers, as do the Eastern Orthodox. So here were all these apologies for persecution and so on. And they got great press for it, apologizing. I got the document and I read it, and it's full of weasel language. It's incredible. It says, for example, at the beginning, all of us, though not personally responsible and without encroaching on the judgment of God, who alone knows every heart, bear the burden of the errors and faults of those who have gone before us. Well, that's reasonable. But then it says, can you actually ascribe guilt to the actions of people of other ages? So it raises a real question. But the nitty-gritty of it, and it's the nitty-gritty of dealing with Rome, period, is it has this parallel statement, again about a third of the way in. It says, just as Christ, holy and undefiled and incapable of error, took upon himself the sins of fallen human beings, so the magisterium of the church, holy and undefiled and incapable of error, will apologize for the actions of sinful fallen human beings. So they're apologizing for what people who called themselves Catholics did, while at the same time not budging an inch on the inviolate superiority of the Catholic Church. And then, to add an extra twist at the end of it, it says, we have apologized. This calls for reciprocity from the Protestants. In other words, say you're sorry and come back. Interesting document. Another one that's not too long ago, Caritas in Veritate. This was Benedict's document. He actually gave a copy of it in 2008 to President Obama, who is heading off after the economic collapse for the first meeting with the G8. It was a desperate moment for the whole Western world. And here Benedict gives him this document, leather-bound, as he heads off. And I read the document, others read it, and it's quite amazing, because in the one document he tries to deal with all of the extant problems of the Western world, things like national sovereignty, capital and labor unions, economic security, the rights of the working man, the environment, even though they've written more on that since. It was all in there. Warfare, how states react to one another. And as one magazine I read, a secular magazine, reviewed it as a political document, which it really is, and they gave it pretty good marks. And I thought they were very perceptive, because at the end they said, it's a pretty good document, but the trouble is you accept this document, the Pope comes with it. He's now the necessary common element to solve these problems. And in fact, in the document, it's very plain about how this is to be addressed. It says there is a need for a global authority to be set up to solve this. He says a global authority with the power to act and to enforce. You know that from prophecy, don't you? But I think it's very significant that they're actually writing this stuff right now. And I'll skip before I go on to something more recent, but I need to tell you something that you may have noticed with the present Pope of Rome. He said several times that he doesn't have much time. Do you remember hearing that? That his time is limited. Now, you and I can't know whether it's because, as an 80-some-year-old man, he thinks that, he's going to drop dead the next moment, or does he have a sense, as the Bishop of Rome, that time is running out, either observing things around him, reading the Bible, or perhaps hearing some of his own apocalyptic Catholic material? Early on in the pontificate of John Paul II, that was 2 popes before the present pope, remember there was a huge event where he was shot in St. Peter's Square. You remember that? If you're old enough, you do. It was sort of like 9/11 on a religious sense. It was horrific. And he survived, and then I've got to respect the man. He went into the prison and spoke with his would-be assassin and forgave him. That was very good. But we heard a rumor at the time, I think Malachi Martin, who wrote The Keys to This Blood, even repeated the rumor, that the Pope had been reading the third message of Fatima at the time, which was supposed to be far in the future. And when he was shot and recovered, he came to believe that it applied to him here and now. For a number of years, that was sort of noised about, but you couldn't prove it. But if you go on the Vatican website, you will find a document that Benedict released a few years ago now on the message of Fatima. And he confirms that this message that was given in 1917, I think, and you might agree, that it was probably different spirits, because these 3 little kids thought they saw a wood spirit, and it was rather fearsome at first, but after talking to the priest, they were convinced that this was the Virgin Mary. And this spirit appeared several times to them and gave them apocalyptic visions that were written down and were so troubling that the Archbishop of Leiria, Portugal, where it was given, sealed it in an envelope and sent it to Rome, where it remained sealed until John Paul II, in his midnight ramblings, decided to read it. And Benedict says that he did decide after his assassination that it applied to him. And let me tell you what that vision is. That third vision that was not supposed to was supposed to be fulfilled, rather, before the third of these 3 young girls died. And the last woman did die around about this time. It tells us, it paints a picture there of a ruined world that seems to have undergone some sort of cataclysm, like a world war, ruined city, and as Benedict outlines it, because he explains it, he gives the transcript, then he explains what he thinks it means. So there's no ambiguity about it. And there's this ruined city, and the Pope and the church leaders make their mournful way through this city, up a hill on the other side of it toward a cross. And as they come up toward the cross, it says, "Men with guns come and kill the Pope," the Holy Father. He's not Holy Father, but that's what they say. Kill him. Meanwhile, up in the sky is the Virgin Mary, and next to her, the angel with the flaming sword that Benedict says is the angel of Revelation, the angel with the sword. And the Virgin Mary, at the time the Pope is killed, reaches out and well, I've got it the wrong way around. The angel is about to destroy the world. He brings his sword up and he cries out 3 times, "Penance, penance, penance." It's like the anti-3 angels' messages. And then the Virgin Mary reaches out a hand and deflects the sword so that he doesn't destroy the world. John Paul II, when he survived that assassination attempt, took the bullet, they found it in the Pope-mobile, and he mounted it in the crown of the statue of the Virgin Mary in Portugal. And he dedicated his pontificate to the Virgin Mary. So it's not inconsequential. But I think there's another reason, and that's an apocalyptic context, feeling that it's all happening now. These end-time events relate to these present popes. But there's another dynamic that you can find if you go online. In about the year 1100, a mystical Irish abbot Saint Malachy. He was sainted by the Roman Catholic Church, so he was held in high regard, made a trip to Rome, and while in Rome was overcome by the Spirit. And which Spirit? We don't know. But he outlined in cryptic form a description of all of the popes till the end of time. And it's not been officially adopted, but you could go on Catholic websites and they pay great attention to it. Like, for example, in one papal election, the prediction said he will come from the sea. And so a couple of the cardinals that wanted to be elected pope rented boats and took them out to sea because they wanted to fulfill the prophecy. Benedict, for example, it said of him that he would come from the Order of the Olives. And so he chose a name from the Benedictines, and their symbol is the olive branch. It's tracking very close. And what's very interesting is that with the resignation of Benedict, it meant that they were right on the final pope, the last one named. And he is named, which could be not necessarily literal, but he's given a name. He's called Peter the Roman, which could mean the archetypal Catholic leader, you know, a Jesuit or an Italian, which of course we have. And on the Catholic websites, they're buzzing about trying to find a meaning to this. But what it says on that last prophecy, it says, Peter the Roman will reign over the Catholic Church at a time of great distress when the 7 hills pass away. That's apocalyptic. And I don't care if the prophecy came from self-delusion, Satan, or in the most unlikely event, even from God. I mean, I care if it comes from God, but it doesn't really matter to what's happening. The point is, I think they half believe it, and it's driving their actions. As Ellen White says, the papacy through the centuries, of course, had purposes that could work out not just in the lifetime of any pope, but they were working methodically toward their end. I think they're in a hurry now. They're not of the same mind. They're trying to rush things. And even one example of that is Francis came and spoke in Washington last September 24, he spoke before Congress. I only discovered recently that in anticipation of his speech, he sent an emissary from Rome to pressure the legislators to put the family rest day, the Sunday family rest day, on the legislative agenda. They want it through. But of course, they wouldn't pass it right now. When the Pope came to Washington, it was in the context, as I say, of these other documents, presenting the power of Rome and the office of the Pope as a necessary power to solve some far-reaching problems. He had written earlier in the year a document called Laudato Si, Praise Be to Thee, and it's a document on the environment. And you should read this one. You probably have too much time to read all of these documents, you know. You can read about them different places, but you should read this document because more than any other document, even the Day of the Lord, Dominus Dei, this is a Sabbath document. It's ostensibly about the environment. And it's not just to Roman Catholics, it's not just to Christians. He gives this document to the whole world. And it's a message of urgency that we need to save this world before mankind destroys it. And I'll read you just a couple of selected passages from it. He says at the beginning, he says, "This, our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains us and who produces various fruits and coloured flowers and herbs." He's giving it a sort of a New Age thing. He says, "This sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will." And I believe he's having a shot here at the dominionists, the religious rightists in our countries. They've seized on dominionism. And it's not, as Adam and Eve were created to care and tend the garden. Dominionism is you pillage the earth at will because God gave it to you. You're the masters of it. And he says, "The violent presence in our heart wounded presence in our heart. Wounded by sin is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness, evidence in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. The earth itself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail, quoting Romans 8:22. You know, we know that as a text referring to the soon coming return of Christ. We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. We breathe her air and we receive life and refreshment from her waters. And he says, more than 50 years ago, with the world teetering on the brink of nuclear crisis, John the 23rd wrote an encyclical which not only rejected war but offered a proposal for peace. And so he goes on here, I would like to enter into a dialogue with all people about our common home. And I'll just read you key things so you'll get a gist of it. He says, Pope Benedict asked her to recognize that the natural environment has been gravely damaged by our irresponsible behavior. We have forgotten that man is not only a freedom which he creates for himself, man does not create himself. He is spirit and will, but also nature. It says the misuse of creation begins when we no longer recognize any higher instance than ourselves, when we see nothing else but ourselves. And then he quotes another patriarch who said, for human beings to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, for human beings to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in its climate, by stripping the earth of its natural forests or destroying its wetlands, for human beings to contaminate the earth's waters, its land, its air, its life, these are sins. For to commit a crime against the natural world is a sin against ourselves and a sin against God. So he's laid this on a huge level, survival and an evil of mankind. And then he says, I urgently appeal for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. Here, the laws found in the Bible dwell on relationships, not only among individuals, but also with other living creatures. You shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen down by the way and withhold your help, quoting from Deuteronomy. Along these same lines, rest on the seventh day is meant not only for human beings, but also so that your ox and your donkey may have rest. He's applying the Sabbath on an ecological level to the whole world. Clearly, the Bible has no place for a tyrannical anthropocentrism unconcerned for other creatures. Disregard for the duty to cultivate and maintain a proper relationship with my neighbour, for whose care and custody I am responsible, ruins my relationship with my own self, with others, with God, and with the earth. When these relationships are neglected, when justice no longer dwells in the land, the Bible tells us that life itself is endangered. So he's talking about, the future of life on earth. And then, picking up on that, he says, although the wickedness of man was great in the earth, Genesis 6:5, and the Lord was sorry that he'd made men, nevertheless, through Noah, who remained innocent and just, God decided to open a path of salvation. In this way, he gave humanity the chance of a new beginning. All it takes is one good person to restore hope. The biblical tradition clearly shows, listen to this, that this renewal entails recovering and respecting the rhythms inscribed in nature by the hand of the Creator. We see this, for example, in the law of the Sabbath. On the seventh day, God rested from all his work. He commanded Israel to set aside each seventh day as a day of rest, a Sabbath. And then there's text to back it up. Similarly, every 7 years, a sabbatical of rest, a Sabbath, was set aside for Israel, a complete rest for the land when sowing was forbidden and one reaped only what was necessary. Finally, after 7 weeks of years, which is to say 49 years, the Jubilee was celebrated as a year of general forgiveness and liberty throughout the land and all of its inhabitants. And Rome has kicked off, I think it's the 50th Jubilee now, supposedly the final Jubilee. And I'll see if I can find another Sabbath connection. But then he converts it, as the Dominus Dei did. It says, on Sunday, our participation in the Eucharist has special importance. Sunday, like the Jewish Sabbath, is meant to be a day which heals our relationships with God, with ourselves, with others, and with the world. Sunday is the day of resurrection, the first day of the new creation. It also proclaims man's eternal rest in God. In this way, Christian spirituality incorporates the value of relaxation and festivity. We are called to include in our work a dimension of receptivity and gratuity, which is quite different from mere inactivity. He's explaining how to keep the seventh day, but applying it to Sunday. It says, the law of weekly rest forbade work on the seventh day, so that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your maidservant and the stranger may be refreshed. Rest opens our eyes to the larger picture and gives us renewed sensitivity to the rights of others. And so the day of rest, centered on the Eucharist, sheds its light on the whole week and motivates us to greater concern for nature and the poor. And at the very end of it, says something very telling. It says, even now we are journeying toward the Sabbath of eternity, the New Jerusalem, toward our coming home in heaven. You know, they're wrong because they've encapsulated a false Saturday or a false Sabbath in this. But the principles that they're embracing are absolutely the truest ones of the Sabbath and of the seventh-day Sabbath. And we've got to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves encountering this, because it will be very hard to say, no, we're not going to keep this family rest day. Why? You set yourself as an enemy of mankind. It's a trap, if you like, that they've laid for a biblical Sabbatarian. But it's to be expected. But this is the final play out, I believe. When the Pope got up before the legislators, he didn't talk much directly about this document, but he alluded to it a number of times. But I found it a fascinating moment. First of all, very early on, he gave a symbol, and I'm hesitating to do it quite, but he gave a three-part signal, giving the all-seeing eye and the 666. If nothing else, he was trying to signal, I think, like many of the pop stars do to your children. I'm sort of with it. I understand the Kabbalistic, even satanic signs. And then he launched off into a speech that I found arrogant to the extreme. He lectured the US on how it was operating, and then he overlaid his whole speech with 4 individuals. There were 2 Roman Catholics that he wanted to implant in the consciousness as Roman Catholics are here to the forefront of life in the United States. There was a nun named Dorothy Day. She was a socialist, communist, if you like, that was pushing for civil reform. There was a priest, Cistercian monk named Thomas Merton, who had majored in Eastern religions, New Age philosophy, spiritualism, which Roman Catholicism is bringing in. And I don't have time to go to it, but if you've read between the lines, perhaps our Adventist Church is battling vigorously what is known as spiritual formation. It's hard to explain it, but the easy way is it's similar, in fact, a direct outgrowth on the mystical exercises that the Catholic Church had nurtured, in particular by the founder of the Jesuit order, Ignatius Loyola. It's spiritualism, and it's mysticism where you seek basically a familiar spirit that indwells you and can give you illumination without reference to God's word. You're not guided by God's word, you're guided by how you invoke this spirit inwardly. And so for him to mention Thomas Merton was, I think, very troubling. The other person that the Pope mentioned was Martin Luther King. That fitted because he was talking about social justice. But what to this day I'm bowled over by, as he began the speech, the Pope mentioned at some length Abraham Lincoln. I love US history. I love all history. And I studied about Abraham Lincoln's assassination, and I remember the details of it, even though it's not regularly listed in the high school textbooks. Most people think Abraham Lincoln was just a simple case and a sad, tragic case of a frustrated actor, John Wilkes Booth, that sympathised with the Southern cause, and so he shot the president, leapt off the stage saying, "So die all tyrants," and then stumbled away to die in a barn. That's just the beginning of it. Most people don't know, and it's not a secret history, it's just not recounted very much, that at the time it was uncovered almost immediately, and I think there were 7 people were hanged as a result of it, including the first ever woman in the United States to be hanged, Mary Surratt, and they found that there was a conspiracy out of her boarding house where 11 people, all of them Roman Catholics except one in the process of being converted, were plotting to bring down the entire government. And on the same night that Abraham Lincoln was shot, the Secretary of State, Seward, was stabbed many times by another conspirator, left for dead. His son was also stabbed and left for dead. There was a planned assassination of the vice president, but there was a miscommunication and he escaped. And also General Grant was to be assassinated, but he escaped. Think about it, if they'd wiped off a lot of them, where would things be? But they arrested the conspirators, hanged them quickly. Mary Surratt's brother, the only true Southern spy in the whole game, was out of town, and he lit out for Canada. Probably came across the border somewhere there. He lit out for Canada and was sheltered by Jesuit priests in Canada, and then made his way to Rome and joined the Pope's bodyguard. You couldn't get a closer association if you tried. And why would the Pope, these many years later, at a historic moment, the first ever religious leader, not just Catholic, to speak to the legislators in a country that has enshrined a separation of church and state in its constitution, why would he wave Abraham Lincoln in front of people? All I can make out is he wanted to see if we noticed. And I haven't read any publication or heard any TV or radio commentary where people have noticed. So we're living through an amazing moment of history. And in conclusion, and I guess I'm following in my predecessor's vein to go a few minutes over, but I wanted to tell you of 2 things. First of all, in 1888, our church came head-to-head with a Sunday law. And I think if things had run a little different, it would have passed, and it probably would have been the final conflict in this country, and then eventually a global Sunday law. The bill called the Blair Bill was a Sunday law. It wasn't a blue law, which most states still have, where they restrict some activities on Sunday. And I'll read you just 2 paragraphs of it. It says, "It's a bill to secure to the people the enjoyment of the first day of the week, commonly known as the Lord's Day, as a day of rest, and to promote its observance as a day of religious worship." I mean, that's a Sunday law, isn't it? It says, "Be it enacted by that was their preface to it, be it enacted that no person or corporation or the agent, servant or employee of any person or corporation shall perform or authorize to be performed any secular work, labor or business to the disturbance of others, works of necessity, mercy and humanity accepted, nor shall any person engage in any play, game, or amusement or recreation to the disturbance of others on the first day of week, commonly known as the Lord's Day." Sounds like the Taliban with no kite flying. It says, "In any territory, district, vessel or place subject to the exclusive jurisdiction of the United States, nor shall it be lawful for any person or corporation to receive pay for labour or service performed or rendered in violation of this section." That's a Sunday law. It didn't get through because our church, as a major force, and a few others that saw the danger of this, rose up and defeated it. But it had the backing of all of the major churches. I'm sure the Catholic Church were behind it, but we've got to be careful when we talk about things. Ellen White is plain that it is not the Roman Catholic Church that enforces or at least brings in the Sunday law here. It's apostate Protestantism in this country where the people rise up and clamour for this papal Sunday. And the chances were very high at that time that it would get through, but it was forced back, and I think we've been given a respite all these years, but now it's upon us again. And I want to conclude by sharing with you from the Adventist Review in 1888. Ellen White said this. She says, "Has the Protestant world stopped to look back at the suffering caused by popery in attempting to bind men's reason so that they should not worship God as seemed right to them?" It says, "And when those were swept away who would not bow to their conscience to any but to the God of heaven, others would spring up to fill their ranks and lift the standards of religious liberty and right. And now this nation, the greatest nation on earth, under whose government we are blessed with every religious and temporal advantage, which has been the recipient of unrivaled mercies, which Providence has watched over and shielded, by which the standard of liberty and religious freedom has been lifted, will it follow the course of the papacy and make void God's law? And shall we sit with folded hands and do nothing in this crisis? Shall we let this religious amendment movement," that's what I just read you, "come in and shut us away from our privileges and rights because we keep the commandments of God? God, help us to arouse from the stupor that has hung over us for years. There are more souls to be saved and a far greater work to be done in warning our world than has yet been accomplished. We should seek God especially, that his grace and his power may be revealed in behalf of the people. We believe that God lives. We do not think the time specified in prophecy, when our liberty should be restricted, has fully come." And she was right. God gave an extension. And he might give an extension again if we rally and raise the alarm. But I doubt if we are, the Bible says a little folding of the hands, a little sleep, a little slumber, and you sail on through. And, I feel satisfied that Liberty's been able to write about this, but we're writing to non-Adventists, to non-Christians in about religious liberty, but in a political sense. So I can't speak of it the same way. But I haven't read in any of our publications any warning about what the Pope said or what his document that calls for a global Sunday law, what it said. It's amazing to me. And I've spoken to some of our top leaders, and they're either unaware of it or unconcerned. Ellen White gave the image in her day of people on a train, because they didn't have planes then. The train with Satan as the engineer, and it was racing toward destruction, and people blithely celebrating and partying on the carriages. But in my view, it's like a plane. I fly all the time, and I'm pretty calm about it now, but I used to freak out every time you got into heavy turbulence, and I thought the wings were about to part company, and I'd be panicking, and I'd look around, and most people appear to be sleeping, and it took me a long time to figure out most people have the ability to close their eyes and wish it away and make believe that it's not happening. I hope we don't fall into that today. None of us want these troubles. I'm certain of it. You have to have a mental aberration to try to bring on persecution. Nobody does. But when it's facing us, as in the Reformation, when the issues are at play, how can we do anything other than make ourselves aware through information, and then as the situations present, speak out and act on it? This is the moment, I believe, for our lifetime, for Seventh-day Adventists to proclaim loudly that the Lord is coming. He's the creator of heaven and earth, and there's your environmental call. And that he has to be honoured. His word is inviolate. It doesn't change. And the signal sign of his creation is the seventh-day Sabbath. It's not given to people without instruction from the Lord, which we do have, to think we can change it. We are under a charter to explain to all around us the meaning of the times and the nearness of the Lord's coming. Let's bow our heads for a word of benediction. Dear Lord, we thank you that as we study the events around us and as we study the continuation of the great deceptions, that while we can see it coming to a head, we thank you that we have this light that's been given to us. We thank you that as we study your word and prayerfully think on these things, that you will give us the power and the spiritual conviction to deal with these. And I pray that each person here will be encouraged in the days ahead that are bound to be interesting, challenging, but above all, the prelude to your soon coming. Thank you for this privilege. For Jesus' sake, amen.